All right, welcome back to the Rathus Chapter 3. And one sec, we'll get this PowerPoint going. Sorry about that. There we go, slideshow. All right, so welcome back. We finished up Chapter 2. The last video you watched, we wrapped up the chapter on biology and psychology. So this chapter, we are going to move on to a new chapter, but one that's in a similar vein. In the sense that we're going to be looking at some of the biological aspects that go into behavior and mental processes. And one of those that we're going to look at is the process of sensation and perception. When I say sensation, I'm referring to like the five senses that you're accustomed to hearing about. Hearing, taste, touch, smell, and sight. There are more to it than that, but that's what I mean by when I say sensation. So we are continuing on our journey of introductory psychology, and let's jump into chapter 3. The goal for this chapter, by the time the chapter is finished, you should be able to define and differentiate between sensation and perception. They are related processes, but they are sort of like two sides to the same coin. And so it's really important to be able to understand the difference between sensation and perception. We're going to then sort of switch gears and really focus in on visual perception, on vision. So we're going to look at the anatomy of the eye. We'll look at the different parts of the eye. You'll be able to explain and identify the different parts, as well as explain, property of light and theories of color, basically how we see, as well as how we organize visual perception, because we really, our eyes, we encounter more visual stimuli than we really can process. So how do we make sense and organize of all the stuff that we encounter? Then we're going to switch gears and look at hearing. So we'll look at the anatomy of the ear, the different parts. You'll also be able to explain how the sense of hearing works, at least from a physiological standpoint goes. Afterwards, we'll switch gears and look at the different other chemical functions, chemical senses like touch, kinesthesis, vestibular sense. Those are really important. Smell, we'll include that as well. And then we'll wrap the chapter up with a discussion on extrasensory perception and why some psychologists, or I should say most psychologists, if not all, are pretty skeptical about the existence of ESP. So unfortunately, I might let some of you down in that section. Maybe you've always thought you've had some sort of psychic powers, or somebody who claims they have psychic powers, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of research that supports that. So anyways, let's move on. Before we do that, though, I'd like to briefly review from Chapter 2 just to kind of keep us thinking about some of the ideas from Chapter 2 so they don't go away completely. Go ahead and, here in just a moment, pause the video and see if you can answer the following review item. Name the 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex and briefly describe their function. So go ahead and pause the video and come back once you've kind of jotted some notes down. Okay, welcome back. You should have paused the video and come back. Let's go through those one at a time. You have the occipital lobe. You should have written something down about the occipital lobe and its relationship to vision. You should have written something down about the temporal lobe, specifically with hearing, with the parietal lobe and touch, and then maybe the frontal lobe, you might have talked about thinking, planning, executive functioning, higher reasoning, things like that, just advanced cognition. So that's just a nice review from chapter 2. Keep thinking about the brain. We're going to talk about it again and again and again. So, just because we move on from chapter 2 to 3 doesn't mean we should forget what we learned in chapter 2. All right, so here's some other questions or statements to prime the pump, truth or fiction. You can pause the video and you can answer for yourself. Mark which ones you think are true, which one you think are false, maybe which ones you aren't sure of, and then you'll check your comprehension as we kind of go along. So let's jump into sensation and perception now. This chapter will be broken up, I think, in about 4 or 5 videos, depending on the length of time it takes me to record. But this first video, we'll just kind of jump into what is sensation and perception, without really exploring any of the specific sensations. So just some key terminology, of course. If we're going to talk about sensation and perception, we should probably have some definitions for those terms. Like I said, you can think about sensation and perception as this kind of twofold process, or maybe two sides of the same coin. On one side, you have sensation, and this is just the stimulation of your sensory receptors on the various sensory organs that you have, like your eyes, your ears, your nose, your skin, etc. So simply just stimulation of those receptors is the process of sensation. This is where sensory information is transmitted to the central nervous system, from the outside environment to your central nervous system. So that's the first step in the process. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. I know it's kind of hard to, it's a funny way to put it, but it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense if the process stopped here. If our receptors, were stimulated and that was it. Well, what the heck do we do once they're stimulated? Well, we got to kind of make sense of all this stimulation, and this is where the process of perception goes in. It's an active process where we try to organize and maybe interpret and make sense of all this sensory information going on around us. And this is what ultimately each of us as human beings use to make an inner representation of the world, how we see it as an individual. Each of us sees the world a little bit differently. That's because we all have different perceptions. You've probably heard that before. Maybe you've gotten into an argument with a friend over, X, Y, or Z, and you're both, one of you's arguing X, the other's arguing for Y, and really, maybe it's somewhere in between, but you both have these two different perceptions that you're kind of butting heads with. So sensation is simply coming into contact with sensory stimuli, and perception is organizing it, making sense of it, interpreting it in a meaningful way. So some pretty important terms, but we need to get them out of the way because that's the heart of this chapter is all the sensory information that we come in contact with, and how do we organize it in a way that makes sense to us. So truth or fiction. People, oh gosh, I'm so sorry I gave that answer away. Pretend I did not do that. Use the MIB memory wiper for just a moment. Pretend I did not do that. I'm so sorry. Truth or fiction, people have only 5 senses. Pause the video if you'd like. Welcome back. The answer you should have put was fiction, because there's far more than just 5. We're only told about 5, but there are far more. I mean, we're only in this chapter going to cover about 7, but the list is probably endless if we think about it. We're not going to talk about like the sense of time or the sense of directions or sense of, things like that. But those are probably important senses to have. We're really going to stick within the realm of the senses that you use every day, and the ones that you probably would really, really take, you would really be upset if you lost. So we're going to go beyond the 5 senses, but by no means are we going to say exhaust the list. Some other important things to consider when thinking about sensation and perception is a few terms to consider. Well, the first one is absolute threshold, and this is a term used to describe the weakest amount of stimuli that we can perceive, but it's really not absolute, because it's really, we're talking about half of the time. So absolute, isn't really all that absolute after all. But this is about the smallest amount of stimuli that we can detect 50% of the time. And of course, some people are going to be more sensitive to that than others. Some people will detect this stuff more than 50%. Some will detect it far less than 50%. So this is just kind of an average. And so here are some examples of absolute threshold of your different senses. For vision, it is a candle flame viewed from about 30 miles away on a clear, dark night. Now, I wear corrective lenses. I wear glasses. So maybe for me, my absolute threshold isn't quite, I'm probably in that lower 50%, like I'm detecting it less than 50% if that really is the absolute threshold. So I might be, but maybe some of you listening to this lecture now, you have great vision and you don't need glasses. And so you can see it, 50% or more each time. So it does depend. For hearing, it is a watch ticking from about 20 feet away in a quiet room. For taste, it's 1 teaspoon of sugar dissolved into 2 gallons of water. And smell, about 1 drop of perfume diffused through a small house, 1 part in 500 million to be specific. And for touch, it is the pressure of a wing of a fly falling on a cheek from a distance of about 0.4 inches. I can't imagine what it must have been like for the person whose job it was to collect fly wings and drop them on people's faces at various distances. Must have been a killer job to have, maybe as an intern. So anyways, that's absolute threshold. This is the smallest amount of information that we can detect roughly about 50% of the time. So let's look at some other important terms in terms of how we make sense of all this information, the stimuli going on around us. Oh, sorry, we have a truth or fiction. My apologies. We do have a truth or fiction. Can't forget those. If we could see waves of light with slightly longer wavelengths, warm-blooded animals would glow in the dark. Truth or fiction? What do you think? Go ahead and pause the video. Check your comprehension. That is true. Welcome back. The answer is, in fact, true. This is some Predator. This question always reminds me of the movie The Predator, being able to see like an infrared and seeing warm-blooded and all those things like that. And yeah, if we saw on a different frequency than we do, then yeah, we probably could see things like that. But we see on the frequency we do, and so we are not blessed with Predator vision, unfortunately. So maybe one of these days, millions of years from now, on the evolutionary scale shifts in our favor. Maybe that's will be the case, but for now, not so much. So absolute threshold is the smallest amount of stimuli that we can perceive. Well, what happens when stimuli is below our absolute threshold? Well, you've probably heard of this before. It's called subliminal messaging or subliminal stimulation. This is where you have sensory stimulation that is below your absolute threshold. It is below your conscious ability to actually perceive it. And again, sometimes you hear it as subliminal messages. Sometimes you hear it as referred to as subliminal perception. But again, it's anything that's below our absolute threshold. For example, an example of this might be visual stimuli, like words that are flashed on a screen so briefly, but you can't actually consciously remember reprocessing the information. Or auditory information that's played so low that you can't hear it, or backwards that you can't understand it. I mean, there are all kinds of famous examples of playing a Led Zeppelin record backwards is supposed to be some kind of subliminal message to worship Satan or something along those lines, which I think has mostly been discredited, but it's a pretty interesting phenomenon nonetheless. So anyways, there's been research that's attempted to address subliminal stimulation. I believe there's a really famous research study where a guy who owned a movie theater decided to plant more words subliminally to see if they would buy more Coke and buy more popcorn, and the results are mixed. I think initially he got surges in sales, but over time it just leveled out, and if I remember right, it really wasn't much to do. But we can be influenced below our absolute threshold. There are examples of studies where people are shown words so fast that they can't actually process them. Some people are shown words to reflect like youth, like young and youthful, whereas other words were primed to make you think about being old. And what they did is they would measure the amount of speed that participants, how long it took them to walk from one end of the hall after seeing these words. And those who saw the words sort of priming you to think about being old, even though they didn't technically see them, they were subliminally influencing their consciousness. They were walking slower from one end of the hall to the next. That was really what was going on in the study, was to see, hey, can we use these words subliminally to maybe change your behavior? And turns out, in small ways, it can. So really, really fascinating stuff. Difference threshold is another important. In order, we have two stimuli. How do we tell the difference between them? Well, there has to be a minimal difference between stimuli to tell them apart, and it could be its percentages. Like I want to say, like a weight. If you were to hold two weights in your hand, they have to at least be 10% difference or something like that. Some small number. They have to be at least that much difference in order for you to tell the difference. Think about if you ever go to like Lowe's and you're picking out paint to paint your house. Well, how the heck do you tell the difference between eggshell white and cream white? I know there's some probably home guru listening to this right now who says, oh, of course, any schmuck can tell the difference. But, for the rest of us, that might be kind of difficult. Well, there has to be this minimum difference in order to tell the difference between two stimuli. And sort of adding on to this is Weber's constant, which is sort of adding on to this difference threshold. It says there is a fraction denoting the difference, perceiving the differences in the intensity of energy. And basically what this means is, so let's say I have 6 candles. I have 6 candles, and I light one more candle to that, and now we have 7 candles. Well, adding 1 to 6, you're probably going to notice the difference. Like, you're going to notice, oh, there's more light, there's more candle. But if I add 1 candle to 60 candles, you probably don't notice the difference. They need to vary in a constant proportion for you to notice the difference. So, for example, in the same example, if I only add 1 candle to the 60, you probably don't notice it. But if I add 10 to that 60, kind of like where I add 1 to the 6, you notice those differences. They're varying. The difference is in proportion, so you can actually tell the difference. It's that constant, that Weber's constant. And again, the just noticeable difference, more terminology, it's the minimal difference that you can detect. Holding a 1 pound weight in your hand and a 2 pound weight in your hand, you're probably not going to notice the difference. But if you hold a 1 pound weight in your hand and a 20 pound weight in your hand, you're definitely going to notice the difference. But there is a certain percentage depending on the stimuli, that you can notice. So the textbook talks about for noticing the difference in weight is about 1 1/53, round it to 1 1/50th or 2%. So that means if you are strong enough to heft a 100-pound barbell, you would not notice that it was heavier until about 2 pounds were added. And yet, if you are a runner who carries 2-pound dumbbells, you would definitely notice if someone slipped you dumbbells even a pound heavier, because the increase would be 50%. So interesting stuff about difference threshold. Signal detection theory, there are certain factors that go into whether or not we perceive certain signals from our environment, and whether we notice those signals or whether those signals are presented. I mean, those are kind of two different stories going on. We not only have to notice the signal is there, but we have to interpret it one way or the other. And so think about, if you've ever, this is probably not a great example, but if you've ever noticed somebody that you were attracted to, that you were physically attracted to, regardless of the gender, regardless of the sex, who you're attracted to. Let's say you go up to you go up to talk to this person and this person smiles. Well, if you notice the signal, hey, the smile is there, you might decide to make a decision. Well, I talked to this person that I'm attracted to and they smiled. Well, I'm going to ask for this person's phone number. And if you were correct and you picked up on the signal and you were correct and that person is interested in you as well, hey, great, you ask for their number and you give you their number. But sometimes it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes we don't even notice they're smiling at us. Maybe, oh my gosh, the person I'm attracted to, I'm so nervous about talking to them, I completely didn't notice that he or she didn't smile, is smiling at me, and then because of that, I decide not to ask for a number and I miss it. I miss the signal. Or I see the signal, but I incorrectly interpret it. It's a smile, but it's just a friendly smile. It is not a romantic smile, so I get rejected. These situations happen all the time in sensory information or personal situations. We're always kind of looking for the signal. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we interpret it correctly, sometimes we don't. So yeah, we're trying to pick out the signal from the noise. We're trying to decide, is that smile really intended to be flirtatious, or is it just a, hey, I'm only smiling at you right now to make you feel better and so you don't go home feeling bad. One of those kind of situations. So be mindful about looking for the signals. Last thing, a couple more slides and we're going to wrap up for this section. We talked about neurons in the last chapter. We talked about neurons firing. Well, one of the particular reasons that neurons fire is in response to sensory features, specifically visual and auditory. We have certain feature detectors in our neurons that will respond and fire to certain things, like when visual information, like to lines and colors and textures and movement. So you'll literally see neurons firing, or certain parts of the brain firing in response to these types of visualizations. In auditory we also have neurons that respond to pitch and loudness. So how we know how loud something is or how quiet something is. Our brain is doing all these sort of the mathematics and the calculations behind the scenes without us even being aware, using these feature detectors. And also our sensory experiences adapt. We adapt. We can either become sensitized. You become more sensitive to stimuli of low magnitudes, or desensitization, where you become less sensitive to stimuli of the same environment. And I'm going to use an example to kind of illustrate both examples. Think about when you walk into a movie theater, and at first, your eyes are having to adjust to the light. Maybe they become desensitized to the darkness as you kind of adjust to the light. And then over time, you can see, at first, maybe you can't see in the dark. You're kind of working your way through a movie theater, you're finding your way to your seat, but after sitting in the theater for an hour or so, hey, your eyes are adjusted, and now that stimuli, it's a little less sensitive, that darkness. You can see better in it. But notice how when you walk out of the movie theater, immediately your eyes have to resensitize to light, and even small amounts of light, you become very sensitive very quickly. You're at first, when you walk out of the theater, you might have to kind of, if you walk outside and it's light outside, or you walk into the lobby and there are a lot of lights, you may have to cover your eyes and kind of adjust again. So our sensation, our perception and sensation, it is subject to change and subject to adaptation, thankfully. Okay, let's check our comprehension before we move on to our next section. Every day you see, hear, smell, taste, and feel stimuli from the outside world. Collecting data about that world is the function of blank, and interpreting the data collected is the function of blank. So go ahead and choose between A, the brain and spinal cord, B, the spinal cord and the brain, C, sensation and perception, or D, perception and sensation. Please go ahead and pause the video and check your comprehension. All right, welcome back. You should have put sensation and perception. So C as in cat. So every day you see, hear, smell, taste, and feel stimuli from the outside world. Collecting data about that world is the function of sensation, and interpreting the data collected is the function of perception. So again, two sides to the same coin, sensation and perception. All right, last thing, true or false, truth or fiction, cierto o falso. People sometimes hear what they want to hear. Go ahead and pause the video, check your comprehension. Welcome back. The answer is true. That is very true. You know, there are a lot of conditions. You know, sometimes we can kind of block and choose what we want to hear, literally. Sometimes conditions make it difficult for us to hear, but definitely. We probably all know this too well. You tell somebody one thing and they hear something the complete opposite because they heard what they wanted to hear, conveniently, or whether they chose to or not. It's funny how that works sometimes. So we're going to go ahead and stop here. I want to stop before we get into vision and start talking about light. So this will wrap up part 1 of chapter 3. I'm probably going to break up the next section of the text, light and vision, into 2 videos. So don't be surprised if you see part 1 and part 2. I think this chapter will probably have about 4 or 5 videos total. So please don't be surprised. But go ahead and stop here, and we'll pick back up here and on the next presentation. All right, take care. Bye.